Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the International Macro History Online Seminar. My name is Kerstin Enflo. I'm a professor in economic history at Lund University, and today we're going to listen to a talk by Professor Rachel Ngai. She's going to talk to us about a paper titled Gender Change, 150 Years of Transformation in US Hours. But before we let and give Rachel the floor, I'd just like to remind you of the rules of engagement. So I'd like to ask you to only ask your questions in the Q&A chat, please. I'll collect them and I'll read them to Rachel. If you have any questions of clarification during the seminar as we go along, please flag them as questions of clarification so I can stop Rachel and ask them during her talk. We'll give her about 40 minutes to do her presentation, and then we got 20 minutes for Q&A session, and we'll end the formal part of the presentation at 6 o'clock Central European time, and then we'll have an additional 15 minutes of more informal chat that you are more than welcome to stay on to. I think that's all for now, and I'm glad to present Rachel Ngai, professor in economics at the LSE, and let her share her slides.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here presenting this work to everyone. I'm very looking forward to the discussion at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so the paper is joined with Claudia Olivetti and Barbara Petrongolo. So we started this paper is that there's been a lot of work about the convergence in the employment between female and male. So typically people, there's hundreds of papers being written in many fields, labor, macro, many, that typically focus on the post-war period, seeing that the female employment rate is catching up with the male employment rate, so that convergence. But when we look, across other country or across other time frame, what we realize is this is not a universal phenomenon. In fact, it's quite well known in the development literature, there's so-called the U-shaped employment for women. So here's a typical picture, among the development literature, where if you plot GDP per capita on the x-axis and female labor force participation on the y-axis, and these are the data from 1960 to 2017. So you put all the data from all the country, the whole panel data into this. And then what you usually typically find is that there's a U-shaped pattern. And this U-shaped pattern is there even if you put in country, fixed effect, etc. And typically people think of the decline is related to a decline in agriculture, and the rise is related to the rise in services. Now, when you compare these two pictures, it's quite puzzling or intriguing to us, because if you look at these developing countries, okay, many of these, for example, the last 30 years, you will see a declining female employment in both India and in China. These are the two countries that has very fast economic growth, and yet their female employment rate is falling. And so, when you look at that with the previous picture of the United States that I show you from US Census, then you feel quite puzzled, because today's developing country is very much like end of 19th century United States. So first, why is today's developing country female employment rate so much higher? As you see in that picture, it's about 60% to 80%. Second, why today's developing country is experiencing a declining trend, whereas in the United States, there seems to be an upward trend. Okay, so that is basically making us quite curious about what is going on. So this paper basically have two objectives. First, we want to understand in general what is the relationship between the structural transformation and female and male employment. Second, we wanted to go back to look at the US historical evidence. Is it really true the female employment rate in the United States is monotonic rising rather than the typical U-shaped pattern that development people have looked at? So to do that, we first go to the data, try to build a consistent measure of employment, both in the extensive margin in terms of bodies and the intensive margin in terms of hours of work for the United States during the last 150 years. After we have done that, we are going to try to convince you. In fact, it turned out that figure I just showed you from the census is wrong. The true figure is the market work for women is U-shaped, just like the figure I showed you with the cross-country evidence. Okay, so we'll come back to this point later. So after I have convinced you about that pattern, then I'm going to present a story with economic mechanism, how this pattern of U-shape for women and declining for men is related to the process of structural transformation. Okay, so that is basically where we stand. Now, just 1 minute on the related work. Now, of course, we are not the first person to talk about U-shape. There's a whole development literature about U-shape. Claudia Gordon actually have looked at the United States historical evidence by focusing on 1890. And her point is 1890 US female employment rates actually turn out to be quite similar to 1930. So if you look back at this picture, basically, Claudia Gordon tried to look at this point, and then she find that this point is quite high, which is like the 1930. And then based on these 2 points, she sort of hypothesized there must be some kind of a U-shape in the United States. So what we did in addition to her work is to try to build a whole measure from 1880 all the way to 2019. And second, we also look at the intensive margin, which is the hours of work, whereas her work basically mainly focused on the body. And then there's also some recent work about how the rise of services related to female market work. What we highlight is it is also important to think about the agriculture sector, especially if we want to learn about what is going to happen to these developing countries like China and India are experiencing decline in female employment. Is it going to happen where they are going to transition into this upward sloping path? All right, so here let me start the data work. So to think about the data work, first, we start with the definition, okay? So what is the definition of employment? In particular, what is that picture I show you with the cross-country evidence where people document the U-shape? That's based on the ILO definition of employment, which say that, as long as the output of the production process is counted in GDP, then the input is employment. So therefore, it counted both, people who work for pay and also people who work for the family business but doesn't get paid. So these are called the unpaid family worker. For example, if the husband owns a farm and the wife works on the farm, she doesn't get paid. In today's definition for employment, she is employed. In fact, in that U-shaped picture I showed you earlier on across many countries, in many developing countries, half of the female employment is due to the unpaid family work. Okay, so this is very important during the initial development stage. Now, this definition is very well established and it seems clear conceptually, but in practice, measuring it is very tricky. So John Durham has a book that collects 133 country census, and his point basically is showing that the measurement of unpaid family work vary a lot across country and across time. Sometimes it's all included, sometimes it's over particular hours is included. It's very inconsistent. Now, turning to the US Census figure I showed you, remember it reported a monotonic rising female employment rate? Now, what we discover is there is a change in definition, okay? Before 1940, census only include gainful employment, meaning that it has to be get paid. So if you don't get paid, you will say, I don't have a gainful occupation. So all these unpaid family workers will not be included in the pre-1940 series, okay? And after 1940, it started to try to account for the unpaid family work, but it's still not very consistent. So here is a paragraph you can see from the book of the US Historical Statistics from 1870. Now, this is a paragraph you can read. Family worker include working farm operator plus member of their family who did unpaid farm work or chores for 15 hours or more during the survey week. So if you do 14 hours, then you are not employed. all persons working 1 hour or more during the survey rate for pay are classified as higher farm worker. So in other words, so if I am a woman, I work on my husband's farm for 14 hours, I will not be employed. But if I go to the neighbor's farm and get paid for 1 hour, then I will show up in that red line, which is the employment. And this, as you can imagine, it will generate a lot of inconsistency over time if you really wanted to know how does the female employment rate change as the country develops. Okay, so this is basically our main mission. We want to get back all these unpaid family workers into that red line I showed you earlier on to understand exactly what happened to female employment rates over the course of development. Now, there are many obvious evidence that red line I showed you earlier on, which say only 15% of women are employed, is a severe undercount of female employment. Take this following example. In 1890, about 40% of population are living on the farm. And among them, 4 million white women are living on the farm. What happened is census will report only 23,000 of these white married women are in agricultural occupation. Okay, so among 4 million, only 23,000 are recorded. And that also explains why, in the 1890, you will see that female employment rate is somewhere around 15%. Now, in 1950, what happened? Many people move out of farm, including women. Now, what the census report? It report 200,000 are unpaid family labor. So what we see is somewhere there, people are moving out of agriculture. On the other hand, the woman that is reported to be working on agriculture increased substantially. Okay, so this is telling you that in 1890, many of these women are not included. Okay. And there's another, piece of evidence is basically in many surveys, they ask whether female member helps on the farm. And 94% of them will say they help on the farm, and in today's concept, they will be counted as employed. So how do we get these people out? Okay, how do we adjust for this unpaid family work? It's very tricky, okay? And so what we have as a first step, we borrow a method from Steve Ruggles. This method is extremely simple, and it's based on the following concept. So he has a paper about how family change in the United States. And then he has this very simple idea. He said, look, in 19th century, there's no job that exists for a man to raise the whole family. So you cannot find a job, men work and get paid, and the whole family doesn't need to work, including the wife, and the wife can focus on home production. So those jobs doesn't exist. In 19th century, what happened is most families have this sort of family enterprise. Whether you have a family farm, you have a family bakery, you make shoes, etc., etc., then all the family members who can help will help. Okay, so there's no idlers. You don't have, a wife where the husband has a farm and the wife just stay inside the household, just doing household work. Now, with this concept, then you can apply a very, brave method. You basically go to the microdata. You say, well, look at this woman. She report not gainfully employed. So she doesn't have a gainful occupation. Let's look at the head of the household. If the head of the household is a farmer and, own a farm, then we say, well, she must be helping on the farm. So therefore, she must be an unpaid family worker in the farm. Okay, so that is the simple concept. You can do the same thing. If the household head for this woman is self-employed in some non-agriculture sector, then we will say she must be helping in that family business as well. Now, this is the first step. You can mention many, consideration. This might be an exaggeration, we maybe overestimate, etc., etc. But for now, we take this first step just to get a broad picture. What is the upper bound of what is going to what is happening during that period of time? Okay. So when you do that, That red line I showed you earlier on, okay, where, only about 12% of women are employed in 1870. When you do the adjustment, immediately what you see is female employment rate suddenly jumped to about 50%, which is quite similar to the employment rate in the 1970s. So this is a big increase in the female employment rate. And the difference between these two is due to the undercounting of the unpaid family work. Now, where are these people working? You can do it by sector. So the top of this picture is like that curve before. And then we look at each individual segment. And what you see is most of the decline in this female total employment rate is due to the decline in the unpaid family work in agriculture sector. So this is saying that during this period, because the family farm is disappearing, so women stop working in it, and that also show up in the aggregate female employment rate, okay? And there's also unpaid family work in manufacturing and also in services. But the big decline is really coming from the agriculture. So from this picture, we sort of get two interesting messages. First of all, the overall employment of women is very likely to be more like a U-shape, like what we see in the cross-country evidence, rather than the monotonic increasing. Second, the declining part of the female U-shape is more associated with the decline in agriculture, whereas the rising part is associated with the rise in services, okay? So this is like the main picture that we want to highlight, whereas for men, it has been just monotonic declining. Whether you adjust it or not, the impact is very small. There are some sons helping with father or brothers helping, but these are very small, okay? So it doesn't affect the overall picture for men very much. Now, with this in mind, then you say, okay, the U-shape you show me is quite likely to be an overestimate because you are counting anyone that do not report a gainful occupation and the household head is self-employed. Immediately you count them as unpaid family worker. Maybe they're not. And also there could be an issue about how many hours they work. So in 1870, even they are helping on the farm, they cannot help that many hours because there's a lot of work to do within the household, okay? Cooking, cleaning, take much longer time than today's time. And second, people who, when you compare to the same employment rate of 50% in 1970, these women would be most likely doing full-time job. So that is a very not comparable. So in that sense, you might argue this must be an overestimate of the U-shape because we are assuming the intensity of the unpaid work in the 1870 is very similar to the intensity of the paid work. So that's the first concern. So that might overestimate the U-shape. But there's another concern, which is that in terms of paid work intensity has also changed a lot. Back then, people are working 6 days a week and 10 hours a day, which is like 16 hours per week. Whereas these days, when we sign employment contract, it's usually 35 hours. So pay work hours has been falling. And so if you put in that, then you will push up the U-shape. So these two forces might make your U-shape look quite different. So this is why we have to turn into hours, okay? And that is also where a lot of the work of this paper have gone into. So we try our best, okay? We first look at, do we know how many hours a paid worker are working? For manufacturing, there is abundance of information, especially from the census of manufacturer. It's very detailed. We have a lot of information. And it is also by gender, etc. For agriculture and for services, service has actually also quite good data. Agriculture is slightly less, but we put together, some other research project from University of California and Harvard Library. And then from 1940 onward, you basically have all the pay hour from the census. So the main period is 1870 to 1940. We rely on quite a lot of different sources. So when we put all these sources together, because of time, I will not explain the detail. In the paper, please refer to it. We have a lot of detail how we come up with these series. When we put them together, basically, we get a message that is quite well known among historians, which is basically pay hour per employee has been falling over time. Okay, so that is the essential message. And with some of the year, we can also estimate the gender wage ratio. And the bottom line of that is that gender wage ratio is quite flat throughout to 1970, and then started rising mainly after 1970. Again, this is quite consistent of what the literature know about. The main challenge and the main, innovative part of the paper is to document the unpaid hour. Meaning, these are the women that we have find out. We find in terms of body, how many of them are unpaid worker. Now we need to find out how many hours these unpaid worker work. Now, what is interesting is, now we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Back then, in the 1920s, we also have the Bureau of Home Statistics. And what is that? Well, because if you're the US government, you look at the official census data, you saw that only about 20%, less than 20% of women are employed. That will make you wonder what are the other 80% of women are doing. So that bureau basically set up this sort of a station across the United States, trying to collect data to find out what they are doing. In particular, in 1925, you had this Pernod Act, where they put a lot of money out there. So U.S. Department of Agriculture, they put out a lot of data, a lot of money, and trying to fund this national representative time use survey, of American homemaker. Now, these homemaker, they are different than what we think of housewife these days. These homemaker are simply, they don't report as gainfully employed. So that is this 80% of the women during that period of time. They want to find out what they do. And then all these studies been published somewhere, scattered around. So we try to gather them all together with a lot of help from other researchers, from social science, from economics, etc. So what we put together is, is this picture that we got all the study from different regions. Some of them we don't have data, but it sort of does have a good coverage of what is all the study that is available. And then when we put all these things together, then what we see is that, so what are these studies? Let me first show you the study before I show you the results. So basically, so this is a time use study of filled in by a lady in 1929, February 9, So this is one of the homemaker. This sort of time use study is very similar to today's time use study, basically asking during this period of time, what were you doing? And they fill it in. Now, when you look at this table, you started to be a bit more conscientious about some selection issue. Remember, this is in 1930s, It's not in 2025. So in 1930s, to do this diary, you have to know how to write, you have to know how to read, and you know how to count. So that is already telling you that there might be a slight selection issue, that people who do this study tend to be a little bit more educated. And I will come back to this point later on. But based on this, you sort of have a picture of what they do. So here's a by Wilson that basically show you a picture. What does homemaker do? So in addition to, a lot of cooking, cleaning, childcare inside the household, they will also spend a couple of hours, go to the family farm. In this case, she's helping to raise the chicken. The chicken will sold to the market. So in today's definition, or in LL definition, she is employed, because she's producing output that is being sold to the market. So this is very important. And there's also another, lot of study that showed you that. So in my previous estimate, when I told you the body, I implicitly make an assumption that as long as you have a family business, with 100%, you have to help. These are some studies that have been put together by various people, and they basically show you that in most cases, more than 90% of them will help. So this gives us some confidence. Our simple, very simple approach is not too far from reality. They do help. And in many cases, they actually work long hours as well, okay? So after you did all this, then you put together all the number of hours, okay? So what we find is the hours spent by the homemaker in farm work are 15 hours in 1920s, 12 hours in 1940s, and 7.5 hours in 1950. Now, when we look at these three numbers, we think of them very likely to be lower bound for three reasons. The first one I already mentioned. The survey tend to be, highly educated women, or they tend to be overrepresented in the survey because you need to know how to write, how to read, and in fact, when we compute the ratio, the average education of the woman that is being surveyed is much higher than the national average. Second, if you are someone who is really busy with farm work, then it's very unlikely you will actually, carry out this kind of survey. Okay, so that is another selection problem. Third, this is really interesting, which is that, this time you study, you have it mostly in rural area, but occasionally you also have it in town. And so we have time you study in the town and in the rural area. Not surprisingly, if you are working, if you are in the town, your cooking time will be shorter than if you live in a rural area, because you will have access to water, all kind of basic utility. Whereas if you are in rural area, sometimes you will have to collect water, collect firewood, so that will make cooking time longer. That's the first thing. But what is interesting is within the rural area, what you see is there are families who live on the farm and families who are not living on the farm. So these are all rural people. What we find is homemakers who live on the farm actually spend about 2 or 3 hours longer than homemaker that does not live on the farm. So one interpretation is that they must be cooking for other people as well. And very likely they are cooking for the farm laborer. And those kind of cooking is like paying wages to the farm laborer. So her input should be part of employment as well. So these are the three reasons we think this must be the lower band. Now, what will be an upper band? Now, if you go to the census from 1940 onward, you have all the hours. Hours for paid worker and hours for unpaid worker. So you can make a comparison. So you can say, oh, if a woman doesn't get pay and she is working on the farm, she work about 32.7 hours. And that hour turned out to be about 93% of the pay hour of a woman who actually get a salary working in the agriculture sector. So this is really an absolute upper band, because you go back to 1870, if you apply that 93%, it will mean that they work quite a long hour, even as an unpaid worker. And that will make it very difficult to combine with their other responsibility looking after the household. Okay, so that's why we think of it as a really upper band. Now, if I do all these upper band and lower band, then the previous figure I show you in terms of the U shape, now we take this range. The lower band is I multiply the body in the previous picture with that 15, 12, and 7.5 hours. That gives me a lower band. The upper band is I use that census ratio and apply to previous years and try to project what is the upper band. So this will be the range. Oops, sorry. How did this pop up? Now, how do I get can I? Oops. No, I'm sorry. See, it's one of these things that always come up when you don't expect it. So if you do that, you basically have a range of the total market hour by woman per woman. And this range is very much due to the range that is due to the agricultural hours. Okay. For men, the adjustment is very little. So when you look at this picture, what we take away is female market hour over the course of development is much more likely to be a U-shape than a monotonic increasing trend. So if you remember the first picture I showed you, you basically have female employment going up like that monotonically. Now, even if you take the lower bound, you will still get a very shallow U-shape, okay? So this is the key message we want to send out from the data work. You know, after you look into both intensive and extensive market, women's market involvement is more likely to be a U-shape than a monotonic increasing. Now, then we use the same time use study. We also put together what happened to the home production hour. Be very careful that home production is quite different from unpaid market work, because the output of the home production is for the family member. It's not counted in the GDP. So therefore, the input, the home production hour, is not employment, okay? Home production is also different from leisure because you enjoy the output of the home production. You don't enjoy the work. You don't enjoy cleaning the dishes. You want to see the dishes clean, which is different from leisure, where in leisure, you enjoy the input. You wanted to watch TV by sitting there watching TV. You don't want to hire someone else to watch the TV for you. Okay, so that makes home production quite different. So when you look at the home production, then it's quite similar to some of the previous work by, say, Valerie Ramey, that home production was quite flat up to about 1950, that female home production hours started falling and male home production hour started rising. Okay, so that is to put together all the data work that we want to explain using a model, is that female market hours is U-shaped, men market hour is monotonic declining. There's a convergence in home hours, and the gender wage ratio has been constant throughout to about 1970, and then it started rising from there. So that's the sort of evidence we want to take away. Then what do we want to do, okay? Now, this sort of U-shape, there are various explanations out there, but there's no, formal model to give you one mechanism to generate this whole U-shape. Okay, so that's our objective. And the mechanism that we propose is basically very obvious from that colorful picture I showed you, which is this U-shape is very much related to the process of structural transformation. Okay, so the objective of writing the model is two objectives. First, we want to see whether the process of structural transformation can qualitatively generate a U-shape. Second, we wanted to say, if you put in reasonable parameter, are these mechanisms giving you a substantial U-shape? Okay, because qualitatively, you can have extremely shallow U-shape or very deep shallow U-shape. So we want to see when you put in the reasonable parameter, can you get that? Now, the model, because of time, I realize I'm not going to show you the equation of the model. Instead, what I will do is put all the theory into this just one picture. Now, what is structural transformation? Structural transformation is observed everywhere across every country in the world. Basically, a decline in agriculture, a rise in services. In some country, manufacturing experience a hump shape. In some country, manufacturing is just monotonic declining. There's a huge literature on structural transformation, and we can summarize that literature in terms of two explanations for structural transformation. One is the income effect or the angle curve. Basically, say agriculture is an inferior good. So as economy become richer, there's a decline in agriculture. Services is more like a luxury good. So as a country develops, there's an increase in services. So that gives you the gray arrow. That's the first explanation. The second explanation for structural transformation is so-called the relative price effect or the Balmer cause disease. So in that example, it's very simple. It's saying that we want all three types of goods, okay? As an individual, I want to consume food, I want to consume clothes, and I also want to consume services. So if services productivity growth is slower than agriculture and manufacturing, over time, in order to achieve equal amounts of quantity of all these three types of goods. The only way to achieve that is to move labor from agriculture into services, okay? So both explanations give you a decline in agriculture and rise in services. And that is what my gray arrow tries to represent. What is important here is because services can be produced by both market services and home services. So this gray arrow moving into services imply some of the market hour is now moving from market to home. And that gives you the decline in market hour. However, over time, because market services is more likely to have faster productivity growth than home services, and these two are good substitutes. So if it is getting cheaper and cheaper to eat out, to have somebody else clean my home, over time, I will start to outsource these home services. And this is what we call the marketization. So these two arrows is always there. But because of the historical evidence, in 1870, agriculture is more than 50% of the labor force. So this gray arrow is very, very strong. And therefore, the gray arrow is dominating the red arrow. So you have market hour decline. By 1950, agriculture is less than 10%, very small. Everything is concentrated here with a lot of hours in the home services. So this is a time when the marketization force is stronger than the structural transformation force. So you observe a rise in the market hour, and that will give you a U shape. Now, this intuition so far, I didn't say anything about gender. So in other words, in principle, we should get a U shape for both men and women. The question is, during the period of 1880 to 2019, why do we only see it for women and not for men? The main reason is because women are the main provider of the home services. So the rise in the market hour apply mostly for women during this period. So the theory will predict eventually men's hour will start coming out later when men is also doing a lot of home production. But when you stop in 2019, the dominant force of marketization only applies for women. And that's why the theory can qualitatively explain the U-shaped female employment and the declining male employment. Okay, so that is basically the theory. And I think I have a few minutes to give you some quantitative illustration. So basically, the idea is to say, okay, we give you one explanation, structural transformation and marketization. But there was a huge literature out there talking about gender. Our mechanism, number one, is gender neutral because this is all based on productivity growth across sector, whether certain goods is inferior good or luxury goods. These have no gender in it. And why they become gender is because of the interaction of the forces and the sector that use women, as I show in this previous picture. The reason that the rising part show up from women is because home services use much more women than men. So therefore, the marketization bites more for women than men. Now, there are many other explanations which we call gender-specific demand shift. And those can be think of, we call of these like so A is agriculture, M is manufacturing, S is services. And Psi basically capture the role of female labor in these different sectors. So there are lots of literature talking about, there's change in gender norm, change in law, technological, that's making that woman have a more important role in this market sector. So what we can do is we use an equilibrium condition to back out these three sides. What is that equilibrium condition? So if you think about a production process that uses both woman and man labor, and then you basically equate the relative wage to the marginal wage of technical substitution. In that equation, you will have gender wage ratio, which you get from the data. You have gender hours ratio, which you get from the data. Then you have this residual, which is the role of woman at Psi in that particular sector. And what you see is if you use the hours and the wage data we constructed, then they infer gender specific production parameter look like this. So in the service sector is rising after 1950, and also in other sector. So what this is showing is kind of consistent with the literature. There could be these changes in gender norm in law that make women being more welcome working in this market sector. Now, the other forces is the gender specific population ratio, because these are the supply forces, basically, and that is going to matter a lot for the gender wage ratio. So we also take that from the data as exogenous. What we see is during 1910 to 1960, there's a big rise in female population relative to the male population. So our strategy is basically to put all these three things together. Our mechanism, structural transformation and marketization, the gender-specific parameter that we infer from the data, the gender-specific population that we obtain from the data, we put all three together, and the model predict both structural transformation and gender hours. And it's quite amazing, a very simple model. It captured both patterns quite well. Now, the next thing we do, which I spend 2 minutes on, is basically we show that if you do the decomposition, how is the U shape related to the three forces? What we find is the declining part of the U shape is very much related to structural transformation and marketization, because the other two gender-specific parameters did not change very much from 1880 to 1940. So in order to understand the decline in market hour, you must have a model with structural transformation. Now, for the upward sloping part, what we find is these gender-specific demand change, like gender norm, law, and all these things, actually play a more important quantitative role compared to structural transformation and marketization. Even though it's explained about 20 to 30%, majority of it is due to this gender-specific role. Now, for wages, the model predicts this sort of upward sloping after the 1970s. But if you only look at the structural transformation and marketization, it should be monotonic rising. The reason that it is flat in the data very likely is because of the change in the female population relative to male that sort of suppress gender wages. So I don't know if I can take 2 minutes, because this is like more to do with history. So I really want to show something about this 2 slides. So one thing that you might ask is, when we do the calibration, we impose the productivity growth. Actually, let me just skip this. Maybe I can come back to it. Someone asked question, because I know that you wanted to conclude it. So let me just conclude that. So what I hope we convinced you is, for the female, it is U-shaped. For male, it's monotonic declining. And the structural transformation play an important role, especially for the declining part. If you don't have structural transformation, you will not be able to get the decline in female employment. And this history perspective is very important for today's developing country. This is the last slide. Because, in many developing countries, we see similar thing happening. We see the structural transformation process. We see fertility is falling, education is rising. So it is rather surprising, if you look at China and India, both countries have fast economic growth, fertility falling, education rising, and yet their female employment is falling. So what we want to highlight is this U shape is not guaranteed. You need the right, formula for it. In the case of US, we saw that those change in gender norm and social and policy, etc., is very important. So we hope this sends a message to developing country. You need to do something about there could be some barrier to move out of the home. Otherwise, the declining shape will just stuck at the downward and it will never come up. So let me stop here. Yeah, sorry for taking time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation. We already actually have some questions coming in, so I'll read them to you, while the rest of you are more than welcome to send your questions through the chat. So we got one from Eugene White, who is wondering about the time series that you showed us, where the pattern looks particularly scattered or wholly in the US South. So he's wondering if there's something about cotton production here in the South, when there's also high poverty and low literacy rates, and where the mechanization of cotton production and the Great Migration have any separable effects and significant effect that you can map out. I'll also read the other question to you, so Shamila gets an answer, because Shamila Mohammed wants you to comment also on how changes in US hours have been influenced by labor laws, and also if you could say something quickly just about the Equal Pay Act, the institutional arrangements, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and how that kind of plays into your model.
Okay, so first of all, this we don't know why there's no data there. So basically, we don't have that. So it could be biasing what we find in different direction, but off the top of my head, I couldn't tell exactly whether these area they would tend to have more unpaid work or less. So if it is that they are mostly more agriculture based, then I would say what we present could be a lower bound, because we don't have these more heavily agriculture state. Okay, so that would be my quick answer. Now for the Equal Act, so basically I will go back to this picture. Okay, so let me now show you where that thing. So basically what I said is the model is very simple. I have production that say you use female labor, you use male labor, you combine it together. And this psi j tells you the importance of the labor. Now this psi j could be a technology parameter, okay, like basically maybe woman is better in doing this. Like people say woman is better in doing services because they have better face-to-face interaction, better communication skill. But it could be like exactly what you said. It is due to some sort of social view about it. It could be the law, the social norm, etc. that tells you how women's perceived ability in this sector is. So when we try to infer it, we look at the gender wage ratio, the gender hours ratio, and then we say this psi j will have to satisfy that. So you could think of the psi j as two components. One component is technology, okay, purely women's comparative advantage. The other component, it could be like, the law, the gender norm. So it could be discrimination, okay? So if you observe a lower gender wage ratio, then that will give you a lower psi j. Whether it's because women don't have a comparative advantage, or it is because there is before the law change, women are getting paid less because of discrimination. We are silent about it. But because we infer it from the data, and that would be consistent with your intuition, basically from 1960 onward, there's a big increase in this psi parameter. And this big increase most likely could be due to these sort of Equal Pay Act and all these changes that you mentioned. Yeah. So.
Thank you. I think Eugene White has raised his hand and would like to follow up. I'd like to ask him to unmute himself, or maybe if I could get some help to unmute him from my team. Sorry, can somebody help me to unmute Eugene?
How's that?
Good. Okay. Yes, I can hear you.
So I'm a little concerned that this is very general and there's some underlying factors as well. One of the important factors you cite is the faster growth of female population. Exactly what period and what is the magnitude of that? It seems that you might be capturing a war effect rather than anything else.
Yeah. So you see, when I was trying to present this, in the beginning, when we do this paper, we only have 1 and 2, because 2 been taught a lot in the literature, including that Equal Pay Act and many law change. So we only have 1 and 2. Then when we were doing that, we find out that the model will definitely produce a monotonic rise in wage ratio. You see, both the one is this solid line from structural transformation and marketization. 2, which is the change in the law and gender norm, everything, is also giving you a monotonic. So if both of these are the only thing that is happening in the data, wage should have been monotonic rising. Yet we see this period that has a very, flat wage ratio. So we started thinking, maybe there's some supply side thing we are not looking. So that was what motivated us to compute this female to male population. Before we had female to male equal to 1 because we thought, naturally it should be 1. But then when we actually go to the data, looking at the population of 18 to 64, female over male, this gray line is the data. So you are right, it is covering this war period. You see 1910, but it go on to around 1970. So it may be an immigration as well. So we are not trying to explain why this is happening. And instead, what we are saying is, because this is happening, it sort of make female wages kind of flat relative to male, despite the other two factor was pushing up female wages. But at the same time, you have a relative increase in female population, and that sort of pressed the wage, flat. Okay, so it's because of these forces that make the final wage, pretty flat during this period. Yeah. So this is something I think very interesting, because before we look at it, we never know this is true. It's big increase from 0.3 all the way to 0.4, and this is relative. So that was something quite, we haven't picked up the economic history literature to see if anyone has
it's something
done.
which really surprises me. I've never heard of that before, and I would think
But this is from the
it would also
census.
affect the marriage markets significantly.
It's quite exciting to look at it, but it's from census data. So
one last point, and that's in terms of your sample data. Is it possible to reweight your population by, if you have, say, matched households from, say, you have in some states, I'll say, cotton producing areas in one state where you have data, and match that to those, it would, and in other words, try and replicate the whole population, because that could have a significant change in effect.
I see. That's interesting. So you're basically saying, let's say these are very similar, and then I use the weights there, and then we weighted to see what is happening there. Yeah. Okay.
Those are large omissions.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah. Right. And that sort of go to my earlier comment about our data is likely to be a lower bound. So it could be that these people are too busy to fill in the survey, so they don't even go there to survey them. I don't know. Yeah, but that suggestion is good, because then we can sort of infer what is happening there. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We got another question from Harun Öztürkler, who wants to ask about the time series properties of your data. So have you had any concerns about that, or have you studied those properties for your model?
You mean for the, okay, let me see if I understand the question. So there's 2 time series we use. One is in terms of bodies, okay, where we basically go to the census data every 10 years. We look at all the women who report they are not gainfully employed and what does their household head do, and then we infer what they are. So that is the every 10 year. Now, in terms of the intensive margin for the pay hours, we have it quite, for many, decile, every 10 years we have the data. But in terms of the unpaid hour, it is true, what we have is quite little. So we have to extrapolate backward. Yeah. So that's how much we have said. There's not that much data. Yeah.
I think Rui has raised his hand. Let's bring in Rui for a while.
Hi. Yes, I did. Thank you very much, Rachel. So 2 questions. First, in distinguishing marketization and structural transformation from gender-specific demand shifters, how does your data classify women working in the offices of manufacturing companies? Right, because it's also a period where a lot of white-collar work is being created. Some of it is very gender-specific. Right. So I don't know. This is really a data, everything is clear in the model, right? But then when you go down to the data, you may be misattributing, right, some of this transformation. And then the other question, this is obvious, of course, right? So your U-shaped, of course, was identified by Claudia Golden, but she focuses mostly on the difference between married and unmarried women, right? So a lot of the missing female work, the unpaid work, is essentially married women working in family farms or family businesses. But it's still a different question whether women were allowed to work on their own, create their own businesses, run their own farms, and so on, right? So could you also speak to that? Thank you.
Okay. In fact, your first question is more a model question than a data question. Let me explain to you why. So I've been working on structural transformation for over 20 years. And in the last decade, there's many more work looking at occupation data, which is what you have in mind. Now, how do you reconcile that? It really depends on the question that we are asking here. You see, the way we think about it, what drives structural transformation? It is the final output, okay? What people consume. So remember, the Engels curve is about what people consume. The BOMO is about what people consume. So what matters is who produce CA, who produce CM, and who produce CZ, okay? Now, if you are a secretary working in a, even working on a farm or working in a manufacturing sector, what you are doing is still contributing, producing CM. So that's why the productivity growth is defined on the value added of the manufacturing sector, regardless of what occupation is in the manufacturing sector. Because what we are interested in is what is the productivity growth in producing this final output? How do people view this final output? Do they view it as an inferior good? Do they view it as a luxurious good? Okay, so independent of what occupation you have. So for this particular question, in fact, I do want women who is a secretary in manufacturing to be counted as a manufacturing employment because they are producing manufacturing goods. So when I was explaining the story, all these are the final output, okay? In terms of the final output, how the employment is being shifted. Yeah, so that is the first question. On the second question, in fact, you are precisely right. This pattern that we show, if we break it down by married woman and single woman, this pattern is because of married women. So on that point is consistent with Claudia Golden. Okay, so what we do in addition to what she does is she did it for 1890, 1 point. We did it for all the points. And we also do it for the hours where she only look at it for the bodies. But you're precisely right. This picture is mostly married women. And this is why when we write a model, we write a household model that we think of, there's men and women in this generating this utility, and the men and women are deciding this consumption. And in the production function, you have men and women, men and women. So in a way, it's as if the model is looking at the average household, and this average household is always men and women together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Time flies, and it's actually already 6 o'clock Central European time. So we are thanking Rachel and Ngai so much for the formal part of this presentation. We are now soon going to move over to the more informal 15 minutes of our talk, where you are more than welcome to ask more questions. But before we do so, I would like to remind everybody who's been here, thank everybody, and also mention that we will be back with the macro seminars again in 2 weeks from now. And next time we will have a speaker who is going to be Massimo Ferrari Minesso from the European Central Bank, who is going to talk about seizing central bank assets. So a paper on that in 2 weeks from now. I think that concludes the formal part of the presentation. So now let's move over to the informal part. And we have a question from Jonathan Jace, who would like to ask about rural to urban migration, but I think we can actually let Jonathan ask it himself if you're around and if I can unmute you. How are you there, Jonathan?
Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. My question is about the demographics of the rural to urban migration. So could it be that the speed of the first decline in women's labor force participation depends on the demographics. Sorry, I'm not phrasing this very well, but were more educated women likely to leave agriculture first? And if so, would that make a difference to the speed of decline?
Yeah, no, this is very good question. The decline, actually, I think the decline is easier because the decline is basically mean you don't work on your farm anymore, or you don't work on your family business anymore. You just become a full-time housewife. Okay, so the decline actually will not be so much affected by that. But I think what you highlighted really matter for the turning part of the U shape. Because the second part, which is how do you move back to the market? Okay, now that you have moved away from agriculture to go home to produce more home production, now can you actually outsource home production and go into manufacturing and service sector? Then that will really matter to what you mentioned, which is the spatial barrier. It could be transportation, it could be migration. So in fact, on my some advertisement, I'm currently working on a project using Chinese data, where you might know that in Chinese, there's a very strictly imposed hukou system. So it's very difficult to migrate. If you don't have the hukou of Shanghai, you go to Shanghai, you will not be able to get education, health, etc. And most importantly, if you were based on a rural area, you are called the agriculture hukou. You actually are entitled to farm land, but you only have the right to use. You don't have the right to transfer. So if you move to this urban sector, you lose all the rents you could have got on the land. So that is a very strong barrier. And in that project, we find that we actually use a spatial data at the district level to identify that sort of barrier has a much tighter impact on women than men. So men just go migrate, whereas the women stay behind to guard the land so that they can still keep the land of the household. So that is, I think, is more about the upward sloping part so if anything, this sort of restriction will prolong the decline in the female employment. And that is what we think is something that might be going on in China, where we see a very strong decline in female employment, despite, more women are getting educated, country is experiencing very fast economic growth, and etc. Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
But we haven't done much in this particular content for the United States. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think Eugene White wants to get back in.
Yeah, I actually went out and looked at historical statistics to see the change. And you're right, there are more women than men. And it's
strange, isn't it? I think it's exciting.
It doesn't coincide with the war. It continues. And it may be differential longevity. And it's differential longevity. It's not going to have the impact on the market that you may think, because women are living longer than men.
So but we restricted to age 64. So it's not, so longevity will be still within age 64. So you see that picture is 18 to 64. So it's still sort of the traditional working age population that we are thinking. But you are right, that might be beyond 64. If you compute that, you get even more women, because women live longer. But it's something that is very interesting that we never know about this, and the magnitude is so big. So we were thinking some historian would tell us, oh, it's something. So the idea floating around is it could be the war, it could be immigration, but it's surprising that it's not taught much, because it goes on from 1910 all the way to 1970, and it's big change. Before we do this, we always thought, oh, it must be 1-to-1, female to male. And then suddenly we see this thing just going up. Yeah. And that solved our puzzle, why gender wage ratio did not rise during that period. In the beginning, we were very puzzled. Something is wrong with the model, something is going on. Then we say, oh God, this is something so obvious. There's a change in relative supply. Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. I would like to see people try to understand it more from a historical perspective. There must be something going on, just that we not yet fully understand what is going on. Yeah. Thank you so much for,
Thank you. There, just keep on asking your questions. I'll take my chair privilege in the meantime and ask one. So I'm really fascinated by your U-shape and how well you're able to replicate it just using the structural change dynamics, especially the downward sloping part. But I was wondering, I mean, when it comes to the upward sloping part, the structural change doesn't work so well for the US, but what if you would look at a European country where public services are a much larger share of the sectoral economy? Do you think you would get a different story where structural change would even explain that upward sloping part, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so actually there has been a lot of work on the role between service sector and the rise in female. I think quantitatively, usually the number is much bigger. So with Barbara previously, we have looked at from 1970 onward using the CPS data. And in that work, we basically find that the rise of services actually also explain the US post-1970 rise quite well. Now, this is all due to calibration because in that paper, we calibrate to 1970. So as you say, there's already changes in the size of the service sector and everything. In this paper, in order to get the whole 150 year, I calibrate everything to 1950. And then I tie my hand down and then say, let the model run. So then I find out, if you have to do the whole 1950 to 2019, then the structural transformation is not that strong because, a lot of change happened between 1950 to 1980 in terms of all these gender-specific things. So I think if you go to, other country data, you will get different quantitative answer. But in a way that we think still, it is still, 20% of the explanation is still a big chunk. Yeah, so that's what but we haven't done it the U-shape for other countries because it's a lot of work to go back to historical data. For post-war data, there's quite some paper now looking at the relationship between service sector and female employment. So, I could, give you more references, but there is lots more paper, and they do find services is very important explaining the rise in female employment.
I think the data you have worked is really amazing. And it's fantastic to see also how you incorporate the intensive margin and the time use. I'll ask, there's another question by Nathan Sussman, actually. Let's bring Nathan in.
Hello.
Hi. Fascinating presentation. Learned a lot. I mean, I wanted to see how your research complements or interacts with the supply side story of Claudia Golden and the fact that rising educational levels of females, and these reforms on the supply side. There's the pill story, all these kind of supply. I would call them supply side type of. They're not so much the structural changes in the economy, but they might have produced structural changes or reinformed structural changes rather than being the outcome of structural changes. So at least economic structural, it could be political or other. But so how do you kind of tie these stories together?
Yeah, so that is the part that we didn't really put in much because right now the only supply thing is what we've been talking about with Eugene is this rise in the population. Now, what you're saying is even though, even if population doesn't change, suppose women's time get free up, what is going to, happen? So in a way, you could think of, we don't have it in it. But on the other hand, if you put the supply side story in, one of the challenge previously in the literature is when you put the supply thing in, it becomes very difficult to explain the rise in the gender wage ratio together with the rise in female employment rate. Because the rise in gender wage ratio is already controlling for education and everything. So therefore, the supply story, it might be quantitatively important for the quantity, but it will make it challenging to understand the gender wage ratio. Yeah, so there's some other supply story which I didn't have time to point out, which is this story of Jeremy Greenwood and the engine of liberalization. So that one was saying basically, oh, you now have electricity, water, household durables, so women have more time, they can work more. Now, interestingly, they also look at a long historical episode. And the data they try to match is this monotonic increasing, okay? And then their argument is, okay, home production is falling and employment is rising, and that is because household durable is getting cheaper and we have more utility. Now, how does that, I thought you were going to ask me that because that seems quite contradictory to what I show you. So if I can share my screen again, you will see that's quite interesting because basically what I show you earlier on is that home production did not fall. So that is quite in contrast to that paper. So what is going on? Now, there are two things. So let's first justify this, and then I come back to that picture. So in the history literature, you might have heard of the Cohen's paradox, which is basically saying, oh, there's a washing machine now, there's all these things. Why is there more work for mother? Okay? So that was, referring to the period of 1930s and the early 20th century. So Joe Mulcair has this very nice paper in the Journal of Economic History. And then he basically say, look, there's two things that is happening during that period. One, the germ theory. People now realize it's important to be clean. So before they wash their bed maybe every few months, now they wash it more. Two, nutrition theory. People realize that it's important to eat well. Before, they only have Sunday rolls. Now we are going to cook food every day. So because of this change in terms of demand for home production, even though the technology is more advanced, they actually don't reduce their time. Now, how did the engine of liberalization get that decline? What happened is they refer to the Livergot table, in pursuing of happiness. But the Livergot table actually is not just the home production time of the wife. It includes the home production time of all the hired help. So what happened actually is that all these machinery, durable good, and utility, they replace the hired work. So now the wife can do this thing herself. She doesn't need the hired work anymore. So that's why we think there are some supply story floating around, okay? But one, have to look at the data in a more careful way. And so we quite, think that this sort of lack of decline in home production is quite true, even for that period of time, yeah. But you are right about the other thing about formula milk, the change in technology, that would be the part that, is not really there.
Yeah, I mean, your kink is more aligned with the golden thing in terms of timing rather than the Greenwood. Definitely the case. And I know, like, with washing machines, you can wash forever. You start washing stuff, you buy more clothes. I mean, these things are endogenous, and it's it's Murphy's law. It's a Murphy's law. As long as you're in the household, even if you add more machines, you just do more. So it's not it's a Murphy law, but it's or Parkinson law. But it's but the kink you have in the decline in home production is more related to, again, to the golden, what I call the supply side on the education, on abilities, etc., at least observed abilities, etc. So anyway, but that's that's why I stand.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we are about to approach the end of the seminar, and I think the final discussion here has been super interesting. It would be actually quite nice to see the reverse pattern as well being presented. So leisure time, men and women divided by gender, and see how that has played out.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mention anything. The model actually have leisure.
Yes.
It's just that because of time, I didn't present it. So the leisure time is increasing, but in general, the total leisure time of women is below men. So throughout history, women just do more home plus market. Yeah. So, but because we don't have more, the increase in leisure time is also driven by the structural transformation. Because if agricultural good is inferior, and you reduce the agricultural good, time is allocated to anything and to other things. And one of the components is leisure. So that's why the model do explain leisure hour is going up over time throughout the 150 years. Yeah. But the increase in leisure time will eventually slow down. Yeah.
That's a fascinating discussion. I'm afraid we won't have time for it now, but hopefully sometime in the future. I think maybe Rui wants to say a few final words. Is that correct?
Just to thank Rachel and you, Kerstin, again. Kerstin, you led beautifully, and Rachel, thanks for bringing such rich and nuanced story to this seminar. You mentioned several times you wanted to hear more from economic historians. We want to hear more from you as well, right? So come again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Thank you, Kerstin.
bye.
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.